Yes.
Okay, starting my time now. To give a brief format, I'm first going to go into define the terms of resolution today, which states Afghan provincial governors should be chosen in direct election rather than being appointed by the president. We're defining this as a policy round because it should. I'll then go into define the way and mechanism of this round today. I'll go into our plain text and then our brief contentions in this round. Okay, so to define it today, every definition is essentially kind of defining context. Provincial governors are the governors of provinces. Direct election is, like current system we have in America, the people directly elect the president, and in the current system in Afghanistan, essentially the president appoints the governors of each province. So that's essentially what all the definitions are here. Our way of mechanism this round today is societal benefits to the Afghanistan people, to the people of Afghanistan. Our actor today is the Afghanistan government. The time frame is as soon as possible. The funding, we don't need any because we're just making an amendment to the Constitution. Our method of implementation is essentially normal ways and means of passing of how Afghanistan passes a constitutional amendment, because we're essentially changing the Constitution or how the people actually, or how leaders are essentially appointed or elected into power. And our way of mechanism was against societal benefits. I'm just really going to kind of define my harms and here with my contentions when I go through them as well. Yes.
Can you just clarify? You said two different weighing mechanisms. Can you clarify which one?
Oh, sorry, societal benefits for Afghanistan. Okay, so now moving on to I have three contentions today. The first is it creates more informed and involved public. The second is it upholds the value of democracy more, and I'll go into why this essentially democracy is good. Essentially it upholds the value of democracy more, and it's what the majority of the people of Afghanistan want. And the third is it promotes equality. So our first contention is that it creates more informed and involved public. So currently the president has the right to move and change governors whenever he pleases. Essentially. So without telling people. So often people of Afghanistan really know when their leaders are actually being changed. There are rarely public announcements that actually tell them. So a lot of times the actual people of Afghanistan aren't aware, aren't informed when these provincial leaders, when these governors are actually being changed. So this is extremely detrimental to the people because they don't know when their leaders are coming in, what the policies of the leaders support, and essentially who is leading them in charge of their government. So even if these people don't believe in democracy, don't believe the democratic system is for real, although the majority of people do believe in democracy, even if some don't, the people should have a right to know what is going on in their government. So that is an essential right that all people in Afghanistan should have. They should have the right to know what their government is doing, what kind of policies they're implementing, and ultimately how they can be more informed. So essentially an informed public should know what's going on in their country. The policies that these governors pass directly affect and directly involve the people as well, so they should know what is currently going on in their with their provinces and what kind of laws are being passed. Furthermore, we can also see that we'll have a more informed public, a more involved public as well. So no matter what more involved public as well. It can be more involved, more enthusiastic voter populace because and less protest and less hatred against government, because they can see that if they directly elect a leader, they can directly elect a leader whose policies best reflect what they believe, what they feel is right, which makes them directly more involved. They feel like they actually have a say in government, actually have a say in the kind of policies that directly affect their life, which means that there will be less protest, less hatred against the government, which we can currently kind of see the status quo right now because people feel that their government doesn't necessarily reflect the best interests that they have best interests right now, so they can ultimately have a say in this as well, which means that there will be less protest, less hatred, etc., and less ultimate disapproval, less chaos and violence against the government, which is ultimately beneficial for Afghanistan, so there's less chaos and violence going on as well, and less disapproval of the government, which are direct societal benefits. Our second contention is it upholds the value of democracy more, and it is what the majority of the people actually want and deserve. So democracy is essentially good because it is a direct representation of what the people want. And so it stands in opposition. The value of democracy stands in opposition to like a totalitarian government or a government where essentially there's one person in charge and he or she leads the country without kind of consulting the people. So democracy is good because it is a direct representation of what the people want, and in that sense people can actually tell the government. And the government ideally is just the role of the government ideally is to serve the people. So essentially, when you have people directly electing a leader with directly electing the leaders with direct representation, that's what democracy best upholds what the people want, what they stand for. So essentially, one of the harms of the status quo currently is that all the provinces are different. They're not all culturally united. So a lot of different provinces have different cultural aspects, different religious aspects, and different actually ways of government. So Karzai, who's the president of Afghanistan right now, doesn't know how each province works, and he typically elects officials who are actually closer to him, not essentially leaders who are actually from these different provinces. So these provinces often don't have a broader understanding or a greater understanding of what each province's needs are, what the cultural needs are, what the religious needs are, or what the actual needs of the people are as well. So he really isn't, they're not really able to best implement the best policies, the best kind of rules and laws that best reflect the cultural religion of each of these places. However, if our plan were to go into action, each province can choose who they want in a more democratic system. So they can choose which kind of the direct representation that they want, the direct leader that they want, who best represents the cultural policies, who best represents the religious policies, or who best represents all of the specific policies that best affect the economies of these different provinces, the best the geographic issues of these regions, as well as the religious and cultural issues of these regions. So this is better direct representation. They're directly this government will directly be able to attend to the needs of all of these people in these various different aspects as well, and ultimately it's better representation. People will be happier with their government when they see that this government is actually reflecting the needs that are more important to them. Once again, there will be less disapproval towards the government, and more of these religious beliefs, important religious beliefs, cultural beliefs, and such will be upheld, which is very important to societal benefits towards the Afghanistan people. Our third is it promotes equality. So currently, women are starting to rise in some positions in government, but I'd like to point out one distinct difference. That these positions in government that women are starting to rise in these positions are not being appointed by the president themselves. These positions are actually elected or chosen by people by officials in the military. So currently, there's a female cultural movement that's actually taking place in Afghanistan, but Karzai, as the President Karzai has kind of stood in direct opposition to this as well. He hasn't really supported this feminist movement. I'd like to point out a few statistics right here to back up what I'm saying. First of all, in agriculture in Afghanistan now, 30% of the employees in Afghanistan, those working in the agricultural industry, are women now, and 15% of women are now actually in medicine right now. So women are actually becoming much more prominent in different positions of Afghanistan government and different positions of the industry. I'd like to point out one major issue though, however, the governors. No females ever actually risen up to the power of governor, which is one of the top political positions in Afghanistan. No females ever reached up to that kind of height of power because of the fact that President Karzai does not support this female empowerment movement that's currently going on. If our plan was to go into action, we can obviously see that because of this cultural movement that's going on among the people, the majority of the people actually support female rights. The majority of the people are actually supporting this and allowing women to come into these different industries and are supporting these female rights as well. So, if direct election was actually to occur, there would be more equality between males and females in the sense because the people who actually support this feminist movement, the majority of males and females in the populace, would be able to elect the female leaders that they actually want as well, which promotes equality. And the impact of this are A, it reflects what the people actually want, which is the democratic idea we were talking about earlier. It reflects that they want these female leaders to be empowered, they want females to take a more dominant role. And B, it actually promotes equality in the sense so males and females become more equal, females have a better opportunity to pursue economic interests, to pursue political interests, and ultimately promote policies that best reflect the rest of the population as well. So all these benefits, my partner will get into more in his speech as well, are just strong vote for the affirmation team. Thank you.
Okay, are we ready? Mm-hmm. So to give an off-camera, I'm going to go over some things about their plan text, their points, and our points. So starting my time, first I have a few questions about their plan text. It was a little bit vague. They didn't say any specifics about exactly how the elections are going to function. They didn't discuss how often the elections are going to be, if there were any methods of someone who was elected who was totally corrupt. They didn't talk about any sort of anti-corruption measures in the election system. When you're talking about a new election, a new democracy, you really need these sorts of procedures in place to make sure corruption doesn't occur. I'm going to talk about this more in our plan text. They also didn't talk about voting logistics. Are the voting polls going to be in the local communities? Are they going to be where the most people are? Are they going to go out and try to reach voters who are really far out in other areas? They didn't really talk about how any of the logistics of the elections are going to work. This is going to be really important because if people don't know that the elections are happening, they can't get to the election, they don't know how often the election is, this really isn't going to have any effect. So they've been really vague in their plan, which hurts our ability to argue against it, because since we don't know how often voting is, we can't make any arguments about social change and the government's not accounting for it. Or we can't know that if there's any difference between Karzai switching his governors all the time and the new governor is switching all the time. So that we can't really make these arguments because they've been vague. So going into their plan text, their contentions. Their first is about an informed public. People never know anything that Karzai's doing. Now, this really isn't, if there are newspapers in Afghanistan, there are things that say what's going on in the country. It's not like it's completely rural anymore. Furthermore, they didn't say why elections would be more publicized than Karzai currently changing the people who are in his government. But people know what's going on in Afghanistan, and even if you believe that they don't, they didn't explain exactly why that's bad. If someone doesn't know who their local governor is, why is that necessarily bad for Afghanistan? They didn't really explain what that would be. They also talked about how voter involvement is really good. They didn't talk about why voter involvement is good. They're relying on all these assumptions that you have about democratic ideals, assuming that voter involvement is good and that people being informed is good. But if they can't actually link out to why these things are beneficial for society in Afghanistan, you really can't vote for them on any of these issues just because you as a judge believe that democratic ideals are beneficial. She also talked about how no more hatred. There's a lot of hatred of the government right now, and that would go away. But what happens when someone votes for someone who doesn't win, or if there's corruption in the system, and the person they vote for doesn't win because an official is bribed or something? They really had no link to why the hatred would change. So the second thing they talked their next point was about democracy. They talked about how they can equally represent all the people in Afghanistan, but they didn't provide any harm. They didn't say to us that there's currently people in Afghanistan are underrepresented. There's a problem with the representation by Karzai. They stated that Karzai was choosing a lot of people who were close to his regime, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the people are misrepresented. If the people want, if people want Karzai, and if people want the kind of democracy that Karzai is trying to form, then it would be good if people are close to Karzai because they can help him with his ideals and they all understand the same thing together. Creates a more unified government. But furthermore, we would argue that there'd be a lot of radical intervention in the government. We're going to talk about this in our points. but there's going to be a lot of people bribing officials to not collect the votes. There are going to be radical groups trying to intervene and gain more votes in illegitimate ways. And so it's not necessarily going to be democratic, especially since these would be the first elections of this kind. A real democracy wouldn't really start right now. So what we're going to argue is by having this system, by having Karzai appoint people, it'll lead to a long-term, more stable democracy, even if there aren't direct democratic elections in this stuff right now. So their third contention is about equality. They talked a lot about women and how Karzai is not choosing any women, and that this is bad for some reason for society. They didn't explain why it was bad for society not to have women, but if you believe that women are equal to men, which you probably do, they have no link to why it is that voters would vote women into power. If you look at the makeup of Afghanistan, a lot of people have conservative views about things like that. People have conservative views about the roles of women in society. A lot of people believe that women shouldn't dress in a certain way. They shouldn't be talking in a certain way. They need to get married to their husband. They talked about how women are working in the fields. But women in the agricultural business are not the same thing as electing a woman to be your governor. They really have absolutely no link to why anyone would vote a woman into power in Afghanistan. These kinds of social changes take forever. In the United States, we still have so many more men, in our legislature. There's absolutely nothing to say that anyone would get into the Afghan legislature at all. So that point is kind of ridiculous, because that would, if they believe that should happen, it would happen over a long time. They need to provide us with those links so that we can properly answer that. So now I'm going to go into our two contentions. Our first is governmental stability, and our second is radical influence. So our first contention is government stability. Now I'm going to talk about the uniqueness, so why the status quo is good in this sense, the link to why their plan harms it, and then the harm, so what's going to happen. So the first thing is that the Karzai regime is gaining legitimacy. Right now, U.S. troops are transferring out, they're transferring power to the Karzai regime. This is giving the regime legitimacy in terms of governing the people, because everyone's understanding that the United States and other countries are leaving, and that Karzai regime is gaining power. Now, the link here is that when the people are directly elected, those people who are directly elected might not be as unified with Karzai's regime. They might be not as likely to implement his goals and to listen to him in terms of what he wants. They might be trying to create their own different governments that aren't the same government that NATO and Karzai have been working together to try to form. So the harm here is that the government will lose its legitimacy because they're not as much of a united front. Right now, when Karzai can control who's in it with him, he can make sure that democratic ideals set in place by NATO and set in place by the other countries remain in the government, because he's been working with us so hard in that respect. And so, when you have all these people who are directly elected, who may not like his goals, he's going to lose that sense of legitimacy. These people aren't going to see the government as a united front, but just the same, similar to what it was before the United States came in, a bunch of local little governments with different factions who believe different things for the government. So another subpoint under this contention uniqueness is that currently the threat of terrorism is under control, and the radical sects of local governments are also under control in the regime, because Karzai have been able to gain a lot of power through having NATO here. The link here is that when there's all this dissent and all these local governors trying to take control, it's a similar link to the other one, but with a different harm and impact. That when all these people are directly elected who don't have alliances with his goals, that radicals will gain power in the region. I'm going to talk about this in my second point also, but this hurts governmental stability, because when you have all these people with the radical views in there who believe that maybe Afghanistan shouldn't be democratic after all, you have the people who don't even believe in the democracy for Afghanistan. So if you really want democracy, you need to have officials that Karzai puts in there because he believes that they can do the job and help Afghanistan work towards a stable democratic government. So our second contention is the radical influence. So subpoint A, the uniqueness. That currently Karzai is not appointing radicals. He's appointing people who who are under his influence, people who he can trust to make a stable democracy. Now, and so what that means is that right now the radical influence is suppressed. So the link here is that when you have people voting, people may vote for a radical government because they may have been swayed in the election polls. If they believe that they still believe that a radical government is good for Afghanistan, maybe they still if at the polls the radical person is the only one who they've been doing a lot of advertising in the region. Since there's not a lot of control over the elections, there's a high likelihood that there could be corruption in the system and that a radical would take power. Now the impact is that it's actually less democratic than the status quo. So if they try to argue too that we're the ones who are, that this side of the argument is not democratic, that him picking isn't, what you need to understand is that we want to have people who believe in the democracy elected, being in the government. This is crucial for the democracy to form correctly. So the next subpoint here is that there's no voting corruption because there isn't voting going on for these provincial governors. And our link here is that there would be more voting corruption because there's not a lot of monitoring over the system. If you look back to their plain vagueness, they haven't provided any sort of system where these elections would be monitored. We've been making sure that officials weren't being bribed to count votes and not count other votes. We're making sure that vote candidates are equally represented in the community. And so these people are going to have more connections to the governments of Iran and Lebanon and Syria, which are really unstable governments. We want these people who are forming the new democracy to have alliances with other democratic countries. We want them to not have these terrorist links. My partner's going to impact this out further, but terrorists are more violent and less good for the social society in Afghanistan. So we are a strong vote in favor of the negation.
starting my time right now. So the first issue with our case is that our plan text was too vague. They never really impacted us to matter to anything. They didn't really give any like T-shell or anything to why this was actually bad. So you really shouldn't be considering this in the round. They just stated this as a fact and then moved on. They really didn't say why it matters in this round. So you really shouldn't be considering this fact. Really what we're looking at right now is looking at the merits of whether or not this law should be passed. Not the little nitpicky parts of it as of how long their election terms are going to be and all of these small things like that that aren't as important in this round. We have to be looking at this holistically as what's best for Afghani society. And really none of these nitpicky things really matter. They talk about the logistical issues and the increase of corruption. I'm going to be getting more into that in their speech, but they've been saying repeatedly that the current government is in control and stable. So obviously there wouldn't be issues with corruption because the stable government would be able to have control over what's going to happen in the areas. There's a lot of influence from the police and military happening in Afghanistan right now. So they would obviously have a huge amount of influence over the elections and make sure that it's not corrupt or there's not terrorists being involved. So really we can see that that's not going to be a problem, and all the rest of it's just kind of nitpicky. So it doesn't really matter. The logistical issues I'll get into more. So our first contention is that in better informing the public, and they seem to try to negate this harm by saying the fact that newspapers exist, that this isn't an issue. However, we can see that the changes that Karzai is currently making to these governors is not being publicly announced. He's not telling the public whether or not this is happening, so the newspapers aren't being to pick this up because he's not actually letting people know when this is happening. So really we can see it, yes, newspapers exist, however, they're not getting the information needed to properly inform the public because these changes are not being expressed publicly. And also we can see, obviously, there's going to be a lot more involvement if people are democratically elected. People are going to be more informed of what's going on because they're actually going to be voting in the leader. That means that they're going to know who the leader is and when he was elected and when he's leaving because they voted him into there. So really we can see that that's not going to be a problem. And they also said, why is an informed voter public good? Caitlin did really impact this out very importantly. If the government is going to be directly involving the people have the right to know whether or not what the government's doing and how it's going to be directly affecting them. And they also have the right to be able to be in control and stop the government if they don't think it's right, but through elections and electing people that they believe will adequately represent them. So really we can see that they didn't really respond to this point. They just said, why is it good? But Caitlin clearly said, well, all the benefits that come out of this, we really should be extending the benefits of having a more informed and more involved public in Afghanistan. And also we can see that we're going to be creating more informed people because when they're being actually directly involved in the elections are more likely to be publicized and they're going to have more knowledge of them. So that's going to be a benefit there. Our second contention is that it holds the power of democracy. And they said that there's no harm here because people are not being misrepresented. However, I'd like to point out again, an idea they've completely dropped in the speech is that every single province of Afghanistan is very different. They're all set up between these massive mountains and these small valleys, and they're very culturally different. They've developed their own cultures over time because they've been so separated for so many decades before the Western influence came in. So we can see that the harm here is that these people are actually not being represented correctly because they have very different views and very different ideals, and they're very different culturally. So right now, Karzai is not equally part of every single province's culture. So what's going to be happening right now is that there's going to be a lot of misrepresentation there, and there's going to be a lot of differences in power. So when the people are democratically elected, that means that there will be a better represented public. Yes.
So if all of these completely different views are represented, wouldn't there be a higher chance that many of the governors elected would be less democratic and less willing to enact democratic reforms?
I'll get into that later, but honestly, I can't imagine someone being elected democratically would be anti-democracy. That doesn't really make any sense to me. So I'm going to go into that more a little bit later. So really, we can see that their only response at this point is that there's no harm, that people are not being misrepresented. However, we've proven that's true based on the cultural differences of the different provinces. So really, we can see that this will be upholding the power of democracy more because all the people will get what they want. Our third point is that it promotes women's right and equality, and that's going to be inherently good. They never said, why are women not getting elected right now? We can see that Karzai has never appointed a woman into this role. This is extremely important because women make up 50% of the population of Afghanistan, and they have the right to be involved in what's actually happening in democracy. And Karzai is denying them from actually having these rights and doing so. So we could really see that what our plan does is solve this problem because there's a major cultural change happening in Afghanistan that Karzai is not a part of, that women are being more involved. We can see that it's going to be a major cultural change, and they said, so what, 30% of all women are farmers. However, farming is the major part of the economy, so it does 80% of all people in Afghanistan are farmers, so having 30% be women shows a major change in what's happening culturally. And they also dropped the three important other ideas we had. The media is being increasingly influenced by women as well, and this is going to be something that's actually going to be influencing the public's view of the government and a lot of things like that. So it's going to be extremely important. Currently, there are 10 major news sites in Afghanistan that are completely run by women anchors and have all women producers. What this means is that people clearly want more women influence in the government and in the media and what's happening in current events. So really, we can see that this is a clear example of the cultural change happening. It's happening mainly in the cities right now, however, expanding into the provinces as well. And also, we can see that 50% of all women are being involved in medicine, showing a positive precedent for women overall. And more women are being appointed into the military and in the police, and getting more involved in the justice system as well. So the logical next step for these people is the government. So really, their only response is, why is women getting elected good? It promotes equality throughout the entire country, promotes feminist involvement, and promotes the humanization of women because currently, traditionally, women have not been treated equally in Afghanistan, and promotes positive change. So really, we can see that all of these benefits in our plan will still be, will still stand, and there's still points. So now let's go into their case. They've had 2 points. The first is that governmental stability will go down, and they say that Karzai is gaining traction and somehow going to be good. However, they never proven today where Karzai is good. Maybe more provincial separation would be better for the people of Afghanistan. We can see, as I've said before, there's a lot of cultural differences between all these provinces, and when in the past the Western influence created one massive country, there was a lot of infighting because all these provinces had different ideas and wanted to get their voices heard in the government. When there's one governor that actually picked by the people, that means that there will be more provincial separation, meaning that they will have more independence in the government, which is what they need right now. That's the best way to have societal benefits, because what they want will be heard more than having Karzai put what he wants in all of these areas. There's going to be a clear benefit there of having more provincial separation. There's going to create more government. Our second response to this is they're going to be creating more government legitimacy, because Karzai will look better, because this is something that people of Afghanistan have been wanting repeatedly. This is a constitutional amendment that has been tried to be passed repeatedly throughout the history of Afghanistan. So when Karzai actually agrees to have this passed, that means he's going to look more legitimate in the eyes of the people, because he's reflecting what the people want. And that's the president's main responsibility. And then also they said there'd be more radicalism, and they said that there's going to be more anti-democratic people being elected into power democratically. That doesn't really make any sense to me. Of course, if someone's going to be enacted democratically, there's going to be a benefit there. And then they said there's going to be an increase of radicalism. However, I'd like to point out that radicals are losing a lot of power in Afghanistan. They won't necessarily win the elections, and even if they do, it's better to enact their radicalism through, if you believe that they are radical, through government processes and government laws than through terrorism. I've never really heard of someone being elected into government and then, or being elected a governor and then doing underground terrorist things. So we could really see that what's going to happen here is that they're going to gain legitimacy in the government, and they're going to go through other means rather than terrorism. They are elected and want to get rid of democracy. They're going to be passing laws instead of blowing schools up. So we could really see that there's going to be a lot more safety there, and it will be more legitimate and it will be safer in that reason. And then they also said there's going to be a big issue with corruption. I already got into that. The government is in control right now. That means there's going to be monitoring that would exist. Obviously, there's a big influence from the police and the military happening. There's obviously going to be some involvement by the government. So really, we can see corruption is not going to be a major issue since there are people monitoring what's going to be happening. So really, none of their points still stand in this round and really shouldn't be considered. So for all the impacts that the government team has for the benefits of society of Afghanistan, I urge a strong vote in favor of the government team. Thank you.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Yeah. Okay, brief roadmap. I'm going to talk about the vagueness of the plan. I'm going to go into their case and our case. Okay, first off I want to talk about the vagueness of the plan, or what Marco calls the nitpicky details. Now really, I don't see these details as nitpicky, because when we're looking about enacting a plan in the real world, it seems very crucial that any such constitutional amendment should dictate how often we have elections, how often there's how we deal with corruption, and who counts these ballots. These are all key details that need to be in any plan, or else there's no way to stop people from corrupting these democratic processes, and there's no way to stop people from coercing people into voting certain ways, and there's no way to stop people from bribing election officials, and there's no way to dictate how often a new governor is elected. So all these issues are key in the need to be present in the plan of the government team, or else there's no way to stop corruption, and there's no way to stop ballot counting, false ballot counting, and bribery. Now what happens if you have a vague plan in which corruption and all these things exist? Well, what happens is that the democracy that the government team is trying to work so hard for, it goes down, because what we can see is that we can see radical terrorist groups can influence elections, people with money can influence elections, and we don't know how often elections occur, so no one knows when they can really vote for a new government or a new governor. So now I want to talk, and so that's going to be a key issue in this round. Now I want to talk about the whole point about how publicity and the informed public, our opponents continue to go under the false assumption that Afghanistan has no internet, Afghanistan doesn't have newspapers, Afghanistan doesn't have people who are looking at their government and looking at how their government does things. But really, when I was prepping this round, an easy search on Google got all 23 governors of the Afghanistan provinces. It was pretty easy, and I'm here thousands of miles away. Why can't someone who lives in Afghanistan do it? It's the access to information is clear. Secondly, local governments are still being voted for. People still vote for their local governments and still have direct access to local governments. We're just talking about the governor on the highest level. So the whole issue about people not having any say in their government isn't true, because people still vote for their local government and people still have a direct say in local government. However, the people who are enacting policy on the grand scale and that are working in the government in the grand scale all are working for the same agenda. Next, I want to talk about upholding democracy. Again, people still have local governments that they vote for. All we're talking about is these couple of governors that are being elected or not. And is the upholding the president of democracy, is this really more important than stability? This is something you're going to have to analyze in this round. Yes.
Wouldn't you consider the governor, who's the head of the provincial area, as the local government you keep referring to?
I'd say the local government is made up of people who govern the cities, people who are in the legislatures on the municipal size, and the governor governs over a huge tract of territory. So I'd say the governor is very different than the local government. Next, I want to talk about equality and promoting equality and women's rights and why there should be more women in government. Really, the reason that Karzai isn't appointing women to governors is because it would be extremely controversial. If we look at Afghanistan, even though 30% of Afghan farmers may be women, it doesn't mean that women are completely accepted in this society just because there's more and more doctors. Even if we look to the United States, where we are a democratic society with equality, only 17 out of the 100 senators are women. So really, just because we're going to be guaranteeing democratic elections doesn't necessarily mean more women are going to be coming into roles of power. Actually, if we look at what could happen under the government's team's plan, where corruption and ballot counting and coercion is possible, because there's no details in their plan text, then that means different terrorist groups could actually coerce people into not voting for women and not voting for who might best represent them. So this is so all these points slide through, not only because because the government is stable now and there's no reason to change a stable government, but also because in the plan of the government team there are so many loopholes in which democracy can fall through. Okay, so now I want to talk about government stability and why this stability is more important than these democratic values that our government team keeps harping on. What we're seeing is that Afghanistan is still a country that has just been ransacked by war and just has been ransacked by terror and instability. So it is more important that the people governing these different parts of the country and these different provinces, it is important that they all have one wide-sweeping vision for the country so that the country can be united by one vision for social action. And then if you wanted to change that vision for social action, you can elect a new president. What we are seeing is that the government team is creating factions. Even my opponent said that, yes, maybe factions would be good because all these provinces are so different, but when you create factions, what you're going to be creating is you're going to create all these different provinces that will be warring for influence and that will be warring for power and resources. What you're creating factions is you're taking away a united Afghanistan and you're turning it into a disunited collection of different states and governments that are all warring for power and warring for influence, and then no broad sweeping social change enacted on the government level could be implemented because all this policy would be stopped once we get to these provincial governors. Now I want to talk about radicalism. My opponent said that maybe radicalism, my opponent Marcos said maybe radicalism is good. Maybe we should get these radicals in government because this will tone down radicalism. No, this is not what should be happening. We should not put radicals in charge of our government because all we are doing is we will be giving terrorists and radicals control of government resources and government funds and in charge of people in government. Why is this bad? Why is this bad when we have radicals and terrorists in charge of us? It means that corruption, they can take money that should be allocated to the citizens and they can use it and they can corrupt it and they can use it to fund different terrorist activities. And also it means people will be not being represented because of this corruption. So, for the reasons firstly that in the plan of the government team, all these ideals of democracy can't actually be reached because there's no standards on how to deal with corruption, on how to deal with bribe officials, on how to deal with ballot counting. For that reason, so none of the impacts of the government team flow through for that first reason. And secondly, that the status quo and stability is more important than any amount of democracy. I believe you should vote for the opposition team. Thank you.
Okay, is everyone ready? Yeah? Okay, I'm just going to go over voters. So starting my time now, the first thing I'm going to go over is the issue of vagueness. Then I'm going to go into democratic ideals and stability, explain why we have democratic ideals, but even if you don't believe we have those, that stability outweighs the democratic ideals that they provide. So first, the vagueness issue. My partner and I have talked about how they didn't provide, how many times when people will be elected, who would count the voters, all the logistics of the elections. They said these are just nitty-gritty details. Who really cares? Why are these important? I brought up some theoretical detriments to this. My partner brought up some real-world detriments. So I'm going to discuss both. So in the real world, as a judge, when you're voting for this plan, you're voting as if you were going to enact it right now. So you need to vote as if right after you vote for this plan, this is going to happen in Afghanistan. So if this plan went into action in Afghanistan, this vague constitutional amendment, it wouldn't dictate any of the things that would actually happen. So no one there would know who's supposed to count the votes, how often these things are supposed to happen. So you need to adopt paradigms. You need to understand that if you were voting for this right now, it couldn't come into effect because there are not enough logistics to make this happen. Furthermore, if you look at the in-round things that I talked about in my first speech, I talked about the round. How it takes away our effectiveness in arguing against their plan because we don't really understand how the corruption is going to have an effect on the government because we don't know who's going to be counting the ballots. We don't understand how they're going to be counted, where they're going to be processed, and so it's harder because corruption is a huge issue in this round. You create a new democratic system, it's a big deal. So they've taken away our ground by not allowing us to do this. This has created an unfair debate where we can't effectively understand exactly what the logistics of their plan are. So you should vote against them just based on that because it hurts the round. So going into democratic ideals. Their big ideas about democratic ideals that there's an informed public, which kind of relies on the assumption that in the status quo people don't know anything that's happening in Afghanistan. First, they didn't provide how in their plan people would know more. They said, well, if you elect someone, obviously you know what happened. That's not necessarily true. If they believe that right now people don't know who's been selected to govern for them, there's no reason they would know exactly what happened with the election. The word about the elections probably wouldn't get out if you believe in their kind of world where there's no communication in Afghanistan. But furthermore, they didn't talk about why an informed public is necessarily good for stability and for societal benefits. If you look back to the net benefits in this round, they didn't explain why you have to be informed to have a good society. And then the next thing that they talked about was representation. They said, we have equal representation for every single person, that these radical groups should be represented in government. But if you look back to societal benefits, it's not good for the society at large in Afghanistan to have this huge radical influence, which I'm going to explain now when I go over stability. So even if you believe that our plan is less democratic than their plan, even if you believe that this isn't as much a democracy, you should vote for us anyways because we increase stability. They've never counted this point that we increase stability. They just argued that democracies may be more important or that these democratic ideals would be harmed, but everyone here agrees that the current government of Afghanistan is stable. They never really contended this idea that Karzai has the power and legitimacy he needs right now. So if you enact their plan, you can't increase his legitimacy. All you can do is decrease it, so they haven't argued against that concept. So the first thing we talked about are the factions within the government. How right now, it's better to have them united, even if not every single group is represented, it's better to have a united front in the government which can gain legitimacy and do actual things to help people. Because if you have all these little factions, you're never going to be able to get anything done. And a lot of them will have ideas that are not democratic and are not necessarily beneficial for the people. We've worked really hard with Karzai to try to get him to enact democratic ideals and things that we think would be best for the people. And so having all these smaller factions going into the decision would actually harm that. They haven't brought up specific examples of the impacts of having your local government. They just said people need to have their local representative representing them in government, but they haven't talked about any specific changes that would come out of that, or any way it's better for the people. So we believe that it's better to have Karzai put in people who are close to him, who he understands will help with a democratic ideal that he wants to make, help them create a stable Afghanistan, help people in poverty, and make a more good service for healthcare and things. So these are the sorts of things that he wants to do, and we can't ensure that the local governments would want to do that, and would be on board with all of his democratic ideals. So we went on stability there in terms of the factions in the government, but they would be more unstable because they have so many different ideas. Then we go into radicalism. They said it would be better if the radicals are in the government because then they won't be doing terrorism. They didn't really provide a link here, but what part said they have more access to commit acts of terrorism if they are in the government because they have more money, they have access to government funds, government weapons, government information. They know where militaries are going to be. They know all these specific things when you are part of the government. They will increase their power and increase the power of these radical groups in the region. If you look to the Haqqani network, they can gain more power by having representatives in there. My partner talked about, they were like, where's a country where this has ever happened? If you look at Pakistan is a country where they have democratically elected officials who are extraordinarily corrupt. There are a lot of members of radical groups in the Pakistan government. We have seen problems with that. We've seen them doing lots of things that go against democratic ideals. We've seen a lot of problems with them funding groups like the Haqqani network and giving them weapons which they use to harm our efforts in Afghanistan. So we've seen this problem happen before, that with democratically elected governments, people don't necessarily go with the ideas of the regime. Now, if you look to the president of Pakistan, he often wants to try to help make these democratic reforms, but it's really difficult because he can't appoint people who are united. And you see all this instability in Afghanistan. Even though they are a democracy, you see a lot of instability because they have all these democratically elected governors who aren't necessarily representing the better needs of the people. So to go into societal benefits. Now, they haven't explained specifically why all these specific democratic ideals are good for societal benefits, but we have. We've talked about why stability is more important, and stability is more important in Surround because it connects more specifically to the people. The people don't want a radical in power. He's taking away the money. If they're taking tax money, the radical is giving it to a radical group, or they're increasing just the presence of those people in Afghanistan who cause a lot of violence in the region. And you see a lot of you'll see like an increase in tribal warfare. You'll see an increase in these radical groups coming in and trying to mess up the political system. This is really bad for people because then the government cannot function properly. So I have a strong vote in favor of litigation.
go into the voter issues and major issues of this round, and state why the government team should win this round. So I have three major voter issues today. The first is the planned solvency argument. The second is the democratic ideals argument. The third is the stability and radical influence. So we're going to go into the plan. First of all, as my partner brought up in his speech, in the current status quo, the Afghanistan government actually has a really strong military and strong police force. And both speakers have actually conceded that Afghanistan is actually a strong and stable country. They keep talking about how Karzai is moving towards stability. He's a really strong, Afghanistan can be a more strong and stable government right now, and they're implementing democracy, and it's really stable right now. So if they're stable enough right now, if it's as stable as they are, and as the opposition team keeps talking about how, if the government in Afghanistan is as stable as the opposition team keeps saying that they are, aren't they able to count a vote and prevent corruption, such as, wouldn't they be able to count a vote and prevent corruption and prevent all these horrible benefits or detriments that the opposition team keeps talking about? My partner consistently came up here and repeatedly said that the government is stable, it is a stable force, it is militarily strong, and the opposition team actually conceded this as well, and stated that yes, Afghanistan is a strong country, Karzai is moving forward, he has all these democratic ideals, and it is a stable country. So why would a stable country not be able to prevent this corruption? A stable country that has a strong military and an extremely strong police force now that it's been working with the United States. So how would they not be able to prevent this corruption and such, etc.? Furthermore, I really don't have time to get to you. Thank you. Furthermore, as my partner stated, what we're looking at when we're looking at this round is we're looking at the actual benefits and detriments of electing a direct election versus election by president. And my partner and I really do not feel that we are inhibiting or stopping any of the ground of the opposition team. I really don't have time at the end to get to you. Opposition team by not providing the specifics of this plan. It would be easy enough. It's pretty difficult for my partner and I in our 15 minutes of prep to come up with an entire constitutional amendment that says here, in these 4 years we're going to do this. These officials are going to be counting these ballots. These are going to be doing all these little things. Come up with an entire constitutional amendment that says what we're really arguing here are the benefits and the detriments of actually electing a popular direct election rather than influenced or being put in place by a president. Okay, so in that sense, we believe our plan has solvency and we should win on that. Second, to go into our democratic ideals, essentially the speaker conceded that while we do have democratic ideals, the stability and radical influence is going to overpower those. So I'd really like to point out that if I can prove that stability and radical influence really isn't a major issue in this round, we automatically win that democratic ideals argument, because they basically said that yes, there might be some democracy, but the radical influence overrules that as well. So first of all, I'd like to talk about all the areas that we went on in democratic ideals. Equality. They keep talking about how Karzai is this great democratic man, he's implementing all these democratic policies, all these great things, all this equality. Then why isn't he supporting this huge feminist movement, a huge cultural movement that's actually going on currently in Afghanistan? The thing is, he's not supporting it. So he really isn't as democratic as the opposition team keeps trying to make him out to be. So really, he's not supporting this. The court system is not supporting this. Furthermore, the own fact that he's not supporting a democratic system and transitioning into this, because if Afghanistan is as stable as the opposition team stated, they should be in a proper position to actually move towards a more democratic government, or move towards a government where people are actually being electing officials. So why hasn't Karzai done this if he's so democratic? Why hasn't he changed the system so far if he's so democratic? But he hasn't, in a sense. So as my partner has also said as well. Furthermore, the more informed and involved public issue, I'd really talk about how we're winning on a more informed and involved public, because if you ultimately see there are no newspapers and no newspapers and such have actually really published this as well. I believe that my partner and I actually went online and actually looked at the same article that the opposition team was looking at, but what we actually read in the first paragraph was that they didn't know if the list was actually accurate enough, because the fact that the president actually changes the governors so often that people have a hard time tracking which governors are actually coming into power. So in that sense, it was actually hard for the government team to do research, because we weren't sure if the governor list was actually accurate enough. So in that sense, Karzai is not the democratic. Our team actually promotes democratic ideals more, because we win in all three of those areas, and the opposition team has actually conceded that we have democratic values on our side. And third, I'd like to get into this whole stability and radical influence area. First of all, their second speaker brought up how local officials are elected all the time democratically, and it's just only the government that's not elected. So if local officials are elected all the time through a democratic process, why aren't they corrupt? Why isn't there a huge radical influence there? Why is there no non-uniformity as well? Their second speaker brought this up.
Point of order. The idea that the local governments aren't corrupt, so why would it happen now as a new...
It was brought up in the second speaker's speech, so it's my first speech.
This is a new rebuttal. This is a new argument on their side against it.
We have a panel, so we can't rule.
Okay.
Present your claim. Tell me specifically what you think is the new argument. She'll present her defense, and then we'll rule as a panel later on.
Her argument that the local government, that if local governments are elected now, that they prevent corruption and status quo, so for some reason our impacts don't apply, is new.
Okay, well, their second speaker brought up in his second speech how local officials are actually elected on a smaller scale, and these local smaller scales. And I actually asked in the POI in that second speech, wouldn't the governor actually be considered part of these local governments? So I believe that I heard first in his speech about this local government in the process.
Okay.
Okay. Is it okay if I continue?
Yeah.
Okay. So once again, as I was stating before, when their second speaker brought up in his speech, in his first speech, how these local officials are elected all the time, how come we haven't seen any of this non-uniformity or any of this corruption? They're running local governments just as much as anybody else would. We haven't seen this corruption, we haven't seen this non-uniformity or anything as well. Furthermore, I believe that the opposition chief was mistaken in how they actually view what the provincial governor's system actually works. They're treating it as if it's a Congress. So any of these policies that these potential radical governors are employing will actually change how the country works in Afghanistan, but it's actually like a state policy. So the policies actually enacted by one governor in one province doesn't necessarily change the course and effect in another place as well. They actually are like governors as in the United States of America, in the system like the United States of America. So furthermore, as we've seen, this non-uniformity and corruption really, and this radicalism really hasn't happened on a smaller scale in these local governments as the opposition team actually conceded. So why would it actually happen on this grander scale? Why would it happen to these governors as well? So we really can see that they have no links. Their only impact they really had was because they conceded democratic ideals. Is this whole there's going to be horrible stability, horrible radical influence, it's going to be detrimental. We've really proven that this probably isn't going to happen because of this historical precedent. For all these reasons that my partner and I brought up, they're planning to solve CR, just strong vote for the government team. Thank you.
All right. So once again, congratulations to both teams for reaching semifinals. We have one ballot for the negative, one ballot for the affirmative, and we have one more ballot which goes to the negative.
Congratulations to you both.
I feel like the chair should speak first.
Right. Also as the squirrel. So I'm going to try to make this really short. First of all, I thought this was an amazing round. This was a difficult resolution, so you guys both did a really great job with it. And it was close, which gives me an excuse for being a squirrel. I just wanted to note that I'm surprised that in a debate about Afghanistan, like the three major issues with Afghanistan were not mentioned. And that this was the first debate I've ever heard about Afghanistan that did not have the word Taliban in it. Like when you guys say radicals, do you guys mean Taliban?
Yeah. I couldn't think of the word. I was trying to think of it.
I couldn't think of the word Taliban.
Okay, so say Taliban. Like Taliban will win elections. That's bad or that's good. Second, it is a round about Afghanistan that does not mention Americans at all and does not discuss their reaction to this, which is also surprising. And finally, it is a round about Afghanistan that does not discuss Karzai being super corrupt. So the idea that because Karzai is in control, there is no corruption is to be ridiculous, because he is like the symbol of corruption. In fact, the reason why Taliban is popular is because they're seen as less corrupt than Karzai. Not that they're not corrupt, but it's hard to beat Karzai. That being said, the reason why I ended up siding with the affirmative is that, first of all, in terms of the procedural, I did not get a clear even statement that it was a voter until the rebuttal, so I did not vote for the procedural. Second of all, it seems to me that the basic problem that the negative has is that their uniqueness overwhelms their link, right? That is to say that they go on at length about how stable the Afghan government is, and they prove it to the point where it's so stable that little democracy would not destabilize it to the point where they're claiming, right? It's so stable that there wouldn't be corruption. It's so stable that the Taliban can't take over elections and win them by intimidating voters, which means that you don't get access to your offense because of your own arguments, and that means that their democracy impacts, even though they're not particularly well terminalized, and I would do much better job in terminalizing the impacts, their democracy impacts flow through, and I'm giving the ballot to the affirmative.
Okay. So I can see why Artem and I were very close. Where Artem did not see statements of a voter, I saw like a very vague statement of a voter, but one that I thought was enough for a claim of abuse. If you'd done more than said this is nitpicking, it probably would have gone away. But you just can't dismiss like any sort of arguments about planned vagueness, them saying this is abusive, stuff like that. Like, that in of itself probably wasn't going to be enough, but the fact that you kind of blew it away, and then in the end they sort of really blow it up, is a really bad move for you guys. I think especially, like, I know it seemed really weak and flimsy, but they had enough to make it somewhat dangerous, and you can't just say this is nitpicking, it doesn't matter, right? So I vote there, but I also, the issue I have with the case analysis is I think you made a decision you didn't have to make, which is that they made the argument that they knew they weren't really going to win, like, the democracy arguments, so they went really hard for weighing that stability is more important. Instead of arguing democracy is more important, you went for the argument that, like, they don't get any stability, right? And I thought you got a lot of, like, influence on that. You guys never responded to this, like, really silly argument, which is, like, if you're democratically elected, you can't be anti-democratic. Hitler, anyone was elected? But, like, that takes away a lot of your anti-stability arguments. But there is that whole stability argument about Karzai having legitimacy. And I agree that, like, a lot of the uniqueness does overwhelm the link, but they do so much in saying that stability is the only thing we should care about. And stability is so important, and all you try to do is sort of minimize the amount of stability they have, right? You're really clearly winning on the democracy stuff. And I would buy arguments that democratic rights are a lot more important. That's why I was really hesitating, is because I felt like it's the weird thing about party debate. On the line by line, you guys generally did a much more effective job. But they made the right strategic decisions at the end, which is why I voted for them.
I want to say one more thing really quickly.
He's gonna argue with me now.
No, not with you. There were just, like, after Arab Spring, like, recent elections in a bunch of Arab countries where, like, the number of women in the parliament was a major issue. So I was expecting to see something like, well, Egypt had elections and they did not elect a lot of women, but then on the other hand, they did elect some, whereas Afghanis have no female governors. Or actually, they do have one, but that's about it. And she's no longer a governor.
Yeah, also the last thing, I've never seen Afghan rant before where both sides were like, Afghan government is amazing. It's super stable. Like,
it worked to our
really?
favor.
Like, I mean, I might be going there in a year, so I'm glad to hear it's a paradise, but it's not what I hear.
How do I evaluate this round in a different way? I don't evaluate plan vagueness as a voter, because the closest I get to that is that this hurts our ability to argue against that. I don't know why that matters. I do think that it can potentially function, like, I think it's still a potentially functional argument on the solvency level, though really that doesn't matter to me that much at the end of the round. Really, only the opposition in this round to me has anything that's like an intelligible impact. I have no idea why or in what way like democratic participation or like female governors impacts back to the standard. There's absolutely no explanation at any point during the round that happens, which would, in and of itself be enough for me to not evaluate that, but especially the opposition does a good job in the first speech talking about why we shouldn't, like, rely on assumptions about what democratic ideals are good, because that's just not work that you're doing, right? So I would suggest choose a standard that you do directly connect to, or impact. Either of those would help. So since stability and safety are the only two intelligible impacts that I have at the end of the round, even if I grant that there's no corruption because the military and police are super good, there's still a risk of, like, radicals getting elected by popular support, which means there's at least the risk of an impact on the negative and no impact on the affirmative. Although I don't think that's necessarily the way it breaks down, but that's sufficient for me to vote.
Alright. Thanks.
Thank you.